The warlords of the Derek-Vash Dominion feasted in the great halls of Cypher 9, their victory over humanity celebrated with blood wine and the roars of their war beasts. High above them, the banners of 1,000 conquered worlds swayed in the stagnant air, each a symbol of their dominion over the weak. They laughed when Supreme King Kaizor the Undying raised his chalice, his voice thundering across the chamber. The last of the human resistance has been crushed. Their kind is extinguished. A chorus of savage cheers erupted. They had broken the will of countless species before, what made this one any different? Earth had burned like all the others. Yet amid the revelry, a message had arrived only an hour earlier. A strange silence had befallen Sector 9, an entire fortress garrison of 40,000 warriors had ceased all transmissions. No distress signals. No signs of battle. Just silence. The warlords dismissed it. Some minor malfunction. A glitch in their systems. They drank, they roared, they feasted. And then the palace alarms screamed. The grand doors leading into the throne hall shuddered, their massive steel frames bending inward with a sound like the bones of titans snapping. Warlords reached for their weapons. Guards rushed forward, their bladed rifles raised. The war beasts howled. Then the doors exploded. Smoke and fire rolled through the chamber, and he stepped through. Tall. Blood-stained. Human. The last human. His armor was battered, torn in places where energy blades had carved through plating. Blood dripped from the combat knife in his hand. Not his own. Theirs. His shadow stretched across the hall as the flames behind him licked hungrily at the shattered doorway. And in his left hand, dragging along the black stone floor, a severed spine. The chamber fell into absolute, stunned silence. One of the younger warlords took a step forward, eyes locked onto the grisly trophy in disbelief. That cannot be. Elias tossed it. The spine clattered at their feet, vertebrae still slick with blood. The warlord flinched as he recognized the torn crest of Supreme King Kaizor still attached to the skull. The immortal king. The god ruler of the Dominion. Dead. No one spoke. No one moved. Elias slowly lifted his gaze, his dark, sunken eyes taking in the room, assessing. He wasn't here to make speeches. There were no pleas, no demands, no negotiations. Just one man. Standing in the heart of an empire. A warlord broke the silence. He stepped forward, snarling, trying to suppress the tremor in his voice. You think this means anything, human? He spat. You think we fear you? Elias tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then he reached behind his back and pulled out something round, dark, and covered in fresh gore. A head. He threw it. It rolled once. Twice. And then stopped. Every Derek-Vash in the chamber stared at it. It was Warlord Chiron's head. The commander of Sector 9. The fortress that had gone silent. Elias smiled. You should. A warlord roared and lunged. A giant of a beast, armored in dark carapace, standing nearly 3 meters tall. He swung his power axe downward, the weapon splitting the air with a sonic howl. Elias moved like smoke, sidestepping the attack before burying his combat knife into the warlord's throat. A wet, gurgling snarl. Blood spurted onto the floor. Elias twisted the blade, ripped it free, and let the body collapse. Silence. He pointed the dripping knife at the rest of them. Your empire is dead. You just don't know it yet. A dozen warriors charged at once. Elias dropped low, kicking a warlord's knee inward, snapping it with a wet crunch. He plunged his blade under the creature's jaw and ripped it upward, splitting the skull in half. Another came from the right, swinging a plasma saber. Elias dodged by a hair's breadth, grabbing the warlord's wrist and breaking it with a single, brutal twist before shoving his own combat knife through the creature's eye socket. A massive brute swung a war hammer. Elias ducked under the strike and drove his fist into the alien's gut, reaching for the belt, pulling a plasma grenade. Click. He shoved it into the warlord's mouth and kicked him backward into the others. Boom! Flames and gore erupted across the hall. Screams filled the air. The surviving warlords stumbled back, weapons shaking in their hands. They had never seen battle like this. Never seen a human like this. Elias took a step forward. Then another. They stepped back. "Now you run," he mocked. "After all your conquests? All your massacres? You were gods of war." He lifted his blade. "Look at you now." One of the warlords, one who had never lost a battle, shook his head in horrified realization. "This isn't war." His voice was barely a whisper. "This is a hunt." Elias Rourke smiled. And then he went to work. The warlords of the Derek Vash did not run. Not yet. Their kind had conquered worlds, reduced empires to dust, and stood unchallenged for centuries. They had forgotten the taste of fear. But now, as Elias Rourke stood among the twitching corpses of their champions, blade dripping, eyes black with death, they began to remember. A warlord bared his fangs, trying to rally the others. "He's just one man." His voice cracked, betraying the fear creeping up his throat. "Kill him. Rip him apart." Elias tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the command. Then he moved. The first warlord came fast, plasma claws snapping, but Elias was faster. He twisted aside, slamming his combat knife into the alien's ribs. The creature roared, but Elias didn't let go. He dragged the blade through bone and muscle, carving it open from hip to chest in one brutal motion. The warlord crumpled, gasping wetly as his insides spilled onto the floor. Another lunged. Elias ducked, grabbed the alien's own blade arm, and wrenched it sideways, snapping it with a sickening crack. The warlord howled, staggering back, only for Elias to drive his boot into its knee, sending the creature to the ground. He didn't waste time, his knife found the exposed throat, ending it instantly. The others hesitated now, their movements faltering. They had surrounded him, outnumbering him 10-1. It didn't matter. Elias advanced. A warlord swung a massive chain axe, serrated teeth whirring to life. Elias sidestepped just as it came down, missing by a fraction of a second. Before the warlord could recover, he was inside its guard, too close. He rammed his knife into the alien's stomach, twisting it before pulling free. The warlord gasped and staggered back, clutching the wound. Elias didn't watch him fall. He had already turned, already moving. A plasma spear cut through the air where he'd stood moments before. He caught the wielder's wrist, wrenched the weapon free, and shoved it backward, impaling the warlord behind him. The creature gurgled, convulsing as energy burned through its chest, before collapsing in a smoking heap. The others finally broke. Panic spread like wildfire. Warlords who had raised civilizations, who had torn kings from their thrones, were now scrambling to escape, fleeing from a single human. Elias let them run. He turned his attention to the last one standing. The largest. The strongest. High Warlord Vrykos. The alien behemoth was clad in ceremonial armor, the sigils of 1,000 victories etched across his chest plate. He alone had not faltered, had not retreated. He stared at Elias, gripping his war hammer so tightly his claws dug into the shaft. "You," Vrykos growled. His voice was deep, filled with a slow-burning rage. "You are the specter." Elias wiped the blood from his knife on his sleeve. "So they say." Vrykos did not move. Did not charge. He simply exhaled, eyes locked onto the human before him. "I have fought 100 wars," he said. "Stood upon the ruins of empires greater than yours." Elias rolled his shoulders, adjusting his grip on the blade. "And?" The warlord's gaze darkened. "And I have never feared a single enemy." He took a step forward. "Until now." Elias smirked. "Smart." Then Vrykos attacked. For all his size, he was fast, lightning fast. The warhammer came down with terrifying force, shattering the floor where Elias had stood a split second before. He darted sideways, but Vrykos was already pivoting, swinging the weapon in a brutal arc. Elias barely managed to twist away, but the shockwave hit like a freight train, hurling him backward. He slammed into a pillar, pain exploding through his ribs. Vrykos didn't let up. He was on him in an instant, hammer raised. Elias rolled aside as it came crashing down, splintering the pillar into dust. He got to his feet, but Vrykos was already charging, a massive blur of muscle and armor. Elias didn't retreat. He ran forward. The warlord swung. Elias dropped low, skidding beneath the hammer, coming up inside Vrykos' reach. Before the alien could react, Elias drove his knife into his side, right beneath the rib plating. Vrykos roared, backhanding Elias with enough force to send him sprawling. His vision swam, but he forced himself up. The warlord staggered, gripping his side where blood oozed between his fingers. He bared his fangs. "You fight well, human." Elias wiped a streak of blood from his mouth. "You die slow, alien." Vrykos charged again. This time, Elias was ready. He sidestepped at the last moment, spinning behind the warlord, and in one swift motion, he drew the pistol from his belt, a human-made kinetic slug thrower, or relic of Earth's past. He fired. The first shot punched through Vrykos' leg, shattering bone. The warlord stumbled. Elias didn't hesitate, he fired again. Boom! The slug tore through Vrykos' shoulder, spinning him sideways. Elias advanced, pressing the barrel against the alien's skull. "You know what humans do best?" he asked, his voice low. Vrykos spat blood, defiant even in his final moments. "Tell me." Elias pulled the trigger. Boom! The warlord collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. Elias exhaled slowly, lowering the pistol. His ribs ached, his body screamed for rest, but there was no time for that. He looked around. The warlords were dead. The Derek Vash leadership had crumbled. And now, there was only one thing left to do. Elias reloaded, turned toward the towering exit of the chamber, and walked forward. Toward the final battle. Toward the end of the Dominion. The corridors of Cypher 9 were painted in blood. The bodies of elite warriors littered the path behind him, their severed limbs and shattered armor testaments to the fury that had been unleashed. The alarms still blared, but no reinforcements came. No one dared. They had seen what had become of their strongest. Elias walked, steady and unrelenting, his breath even despite the ache in his ribs. His pistol still smoked from its last kill, his combat knife dark with drying gore. Every footstep echoed through the shattered remains of the Empire's most impenetrable fortress. He reached the final door. Beyond it lay the command chamber. The last remnants of the Dominion's leadership. The highest warlords. The ones who had orchestrated the fall of Earth, who had given the orders that reduced his home to ruin. He didn't knock. He kicked the doors in. Inside, the surviving warlords stood in a loose half-circle, their expressions wavering between rage and disbelief. Their armor gleamed, polished with the wealth of 1,000 conquered worlds, but now, in this moment, it was useless. The weapons at their belts trembled in their claws. Elias exhaled slowly, raising his pistol. One warlord stepped forward, desperation laced in his voice. "Wait. We can." Elias shot him in the head. The warlord crumpled, his body hitting the marble floor like a sack of meat. Silence. Elias lowered the gun slightly, scanning the room. "I didn't come here to talk." Another warlord, older, wiser, clenched his fists. "You think killing us will end this war? Another will take our place." Elias nodded slightly. "Maybe." He holstered his pistol. "But they'll know what happened here." The largest warlord, the last true threat, stepped forward. His deep crimson armor was engraved with the skulls of species long extinct, his horns sharpened to gleaming points. His voice was low, measured, deadly. "You are alone, human." Elias cracked his knuckles. "Not the first time." The warlord smiled, revealing rows of serrated teeth. I will mount your skull on my throne. Elias smirked. You can try. The warlord roared, lunging with the speed of a beast. Elias dodged left, feeling the wind of a massive gauntlet fist pass inches from his head. He countered instantly, slamming his blade into the warlord's side, but the alien twisted, knocking Elias backward with a brutal elbow to the ribs. Pain flared, sharp and deep, but Elias had fought worse. He hit the ground rolling, coming up just as the warlord charged again. This time, Elias didn't evade. He met him head-on. The first strike was a rapid elbow to the warlord's throat, making him gag. Elias followed up with a knee to the gut, then drove his knife into the alien's thigh, twisting the blade. The warlord howled, but recovered quickly, slamming a fist into Elias's side. Elias staggered, spitting blood. The warlord grinned. You're dying, human. Elias wiped his mouth, grinning back. So are you. The warlord's eyes flickered down to the grenade hooked onto his belt. Elias yanked the pin. The explosion was deafening. The warlord's chest ripped open, his armor disintegrating in a fiery blast. He staggered, gaping down at his own exposed ribs, barely able to comprehend what had happened. Elias didn't give him time. He stepped forward, knife in hand, and buried it in the alien's throat. The warlord made a sound, half a gurgle, half a curse, before collapsing. The last of the Dominion's generals. Dead. Elias turned to the remaining warlords, the ones who hadn't moved, who had stood there, frozen, watching their last champion fall. No words were spoken. He stepped forward, slow, deliberate. They stepped back. One of them, one who had commanded the destruction of an entire human colony, fell to his knees. His voice trembled. Please. We surrender. Elias stopped, tilting his head. Surrender? The warlord swallowed hard. We will retreat from your worlds. We will leave humanity in peace. This does not have to continue. Elias studied them. The mighty warlords of the Darak-Vash Dominion, reduced to cowards, to begging. He could end them all right here. Leave no survivors. No chance for them to rebuild. But that wasn't the way of a soldier. And he was still a soldier. Even now. He let the silence stretch before finally speaking. You will recall every fleet. Every warship. You will abandon every world that was once ours. And you will never return. The warlord nodded rapidly. Yes. Yes. We swear it. Elias turned, his gaze cold. If I ever see a Darak-Vash ship near a human world again, I will return. He gestured at the corpses surrounding him. And I will finish what I started. The warlords flinched. Elias didn't wait for their response. He turned and walked away. Past the corpses. Past the destruction. Through the shattered remains of the empire that had once brought Earth to its knees. And as he left, he could hear them whispering. Not of their king. Not of their fallen champions. But of him. The specter. The human who had walked alone into the heart of their empire. And walked out alive. The transmission spread like wildfire across the Dominion's core worlds. A grainy, flickering image, barely stable, but undeniable. The throne room of Cypher 9, once the impenetrable heart of their empire, now littered with corpses. The bodies of warlords, shattered and bloodied, strewn across the black stone floor. The twisted remains of their supreme king, his spine torn from his body. And standing at the center of it all, him. A single human. Battered, bleeding, victorious. Elias Rourke stared into the war-cracked camera, his breath slow and measured. His armor was torn, black with the blood of those who thought they were gods. His combat knife gleamed in his grip, a silent reminder of the truth the Darak-Vash had refused to acknowledge. They were never gods. Just prey. His voice, low and steady, carried through the Dominion's networks. Your empire is over. A ripple of silence followed across the stars. Entire fleets hesitated mid-flight. Armies paused in the trenches. Civilizations under occupation, once drowning in despair, felt hope for the first time. The Dominion had declared war on humanity. And humanity had answered. He stepped over the corpse of the last High Warlord and moved toward the grand doors of the throne chamber, pushing them open with a single, steady motion. What lay beyond was a sight no Derek Vash had ever imagined. The Stronghold was burning. The great banners of their conquests, set ablaze. Their unbreakable legions, slaughtered. Their war machines, the very symbols of their power, now nothing but wreckage beneath the smoke-choked sky. The planetary defenses had fallen. The impossible had been made real. The empire that had subjugated thousands of species had just lost to a single man. Elias walked forward, stepping onto the grand platform that overlooked the city below. His earpiece crackled to life. "Rourke," came the voice. "Captain Danner, one of the last remaining resistance leaders. Jesus Christ. You actually did it." Elias didn't answer. His eyes were on the fleet that loomed overhead, the remnants of the Derek Vash's once mighty armada. They had gathered above Zephyr 9, preparing for retribution, preparing to wipe out whatever had done this. They hesitated. For the first time in their history, the Derek Vash hesitated. Elias keyed the transmitter again, his voice cutting across their network. This was never a war. It was a reckoning. And you have two choices. The silence stretched. You can run. You can scatter like rats and pray that I never find you. He let the words settle. Let them feel the weight of them. Or you can stay. And I will finish what I started. The answer came within moments. The warships began turning away. One by one, they peeled off, breaking formation, retreating into deep space. They did not fire. Did not launch a final strike. They did what no Derek Vash had ever done before. They fled. Elias exhaled slowly, watching them go. Behind him, a low rumble built across the city. It started as a whisper, a flicker of disbelief. And then it grew. The sound of chains breaking. The enslaved races of the Dominion, those who had been stripped of their worlds, their histories, their futures, were beginning to rise. Word would spread. The iron grip of the Derek Vash was fracturing. Entire colonies would rebel. The species that had been trampled underfoot for centuries would rise up and tear their former masters apart. The Dominion was collapsing. Not in fire. Not in battle. But in fear. Elias turned away from the sight, stepping back into the ruined halls of the palace. He was done here. His mission was complete. A final transmission crackled into his ear. "Where will you go now?" Danner asked. Elias didn't hesitate. "Somewhere quiet." Danner chuckled. "Somehow, I doubt that." Elias smirked slightly, wiping the blood from his blade. "Guess we'll see." And with that, he disappeared into the ruins, a phantom slipping back into the void. The last human warrior. The man who walked into the heart of an empire alone. And walked out carrying its king's spine.